I like a good set of printed slides. I've realized that I can't think unless I write. And so I'll be meeting with people and I'll be talking to them, and my brain will just go blank. Like, all right, let me get a piece of paper. And I start writing, and it just starts flowing. You know,
There's science behind that.
Well, hey, we have a few slides left from yesterday's lecture, and then we'll jump in and we'll start looking at the stuff from today's lecture. Just as a quick reminder, tomorrow will be a recorded lecture with all the festivities going on around graduation and that fun stuff. So I'll get that recorded this afternoon, and with processing times and all that kind of fun stuff, I'll make sure that that is posted and available for you guys by tomorrow morning at the start time of class. So if you want to just keep your routine because you already have this time blocked off, then that'll be available to where you can watch that video.
And the recording will be in Blackboard then, right?
Yeah, so I posted yesterday's this morning.
Okay.
And so that should be available. If that's not true, please let me know. But yeah, I'm thinking that should be available to you at this point. They usually take a couple hours to process, and so I got yesterday's posted late, but I'll make sure to get those up and posted. Again, especially for you guys that are online students, I don't want you to feel like you're a whole day behind based on the timing of lecture recording coming up on Blackboard. So I'll be pretty diligent about getting those up as quickly as possible. All right, so we kind of finished our discussion yesterday in talking about what's the role of a scientist in the policy realm, right? And we talked a whole lot about just the research process and how we objectively approach that process to produce good additions to the literature. All right, so when we're thinking about this, there's a couple of different types of research that we look at, right? And this is not just for regulatory policy. This is from a research perspective as it applies to any topic. Okay, so the first type of research is normative. These are your theoretical pieces, and they represent what ought to be. And so we talked about this rationality assumption a lot yesterday. And that's a product of normative theoretical research and the theories that come out of that process. Okay, then we have positive research, and there's different types of positive research. Okay, so the big umbrella, normative, what ought to be positive, and some things that fall into that, where we have descriptive, predictive, and prescriptive. Okay, so descriptive, just what is, right? I can come in and say, hey, listen, without doing a whole lot of comparison, this is just the state of the world based on the research question that I'm observing. Predictive has some normative features tied into it, right? And so normative usually tests things mathematically and builds a theory, and again, produces this what ought to be scenario. Predictive says, hey, listen, looking at a theoretical model, we can say what ought to be, but we're also going to make some predictions on what is likely to be. And with predictive research, there may be some empirical testing of data, and there may not be. But it will go as far as to say, hey, listen, if we're considering a normative framework, we recognize that normative framework might break down. And here are some of the interferences that we think might cause a breakdown. And if these interferences come into play, then this is likely what would be the result. Okay. And so there's yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. My friend Tom Gilmore is in the waiting room. Can you let him in?
Yes, I can.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, you bet. Thank you very much. And then prescriptive is what could be, right? What could be if we made adjustments based on observations. Okay, so my guess is you guys and your research will live in the descriptive and the prescriptive world. Okay. I don't see a whole lot of research coming out of our program that is predictive. And I see zero research coming out of our program that's normative. Because the amount of time that it would take you to produce a valid normative paper is substantial. I would go as far as to say if you went and looked up seminal articles on just about any topic that represent normative research, zero of those articles were written by professors at Texas Tech University. No offense to Texas Tech University faculty, but most of that stuff is coming out of what I would call elite universities, which Texas Tech is, right? Comes up, but for different reasons. All right, so just a thought. And so when you're thinking about these things, it's really important to understand the normative research, so that when you're describing something from a what is perspective or a what could be perspective, you're really saying, hey, listen, this is why we think this is important, right? We have deviations from the norm, and we think that those deviations are caused by these interferences. And we're going to give some insight into what we think might be solutions to improve the interference so that outcomes are better. In our case, for the consumer, right? For the individual or the household. So the question is always then, is there any validity to normative research, right? What do you guys think?
There is.
Yeah.
There is.
Yeah, it's not crazy, right? To say, hey, listen, we're going to make this assumption of full and perfect information and complete rationality. We know that's not realistic, right? We know that's not realistic, but it does set the stage for us to have an ideal. And if we can compare against an ideal, then we can understand how high quality or low quality an alternative is in comparison to the normative approach. And so there's still a ton of value in understanding, right? Very valuable to our research process.
Can I pick on the normative and our university? You said there is virtually no output in that realm. Is it a case that we are not investing into the people to be able to produce? Because I love such research, because it's, as you said, it sets the stage. It becomes a reference point with which to compare whatever we have out there to be able to work towards the ideal. So I'm surprised to hear that nothing.
I probably overstepped. I would say in the social sciences, we're not seeing any of that stuff. Like if you went to the hard sciences, you might see some normative stuff coming out of the hard sciences. I mean, we have great reputations in engineering as an example, right? Where we're really thought of as on the cutting edge and forefront of that academic field. And so we may very well have some stuff coming out. I would say for, and a lot of it is based on incentive. Okay. And so every program is different. And I'm probably biased by ours. There's no incentive for the social science fields that I'm aware of at this university to pursue normative research, especially in the pre-tenure phase, right? Like there's no reward for that. It'll get you fired. And because the timeline on producing that is long. Now you might have some post-tenure pursuits on those things, and again, I think the hard sciences probably reward that differently from a publication process and different things like that. But in the social sciences, funding is really tough in terms of pursuing that type of research. Teaching loads aren't conducive to those things. I mean, even in a 2-2, right? It's very difficult to have the time to dedicate towards moderate research. If you had like a 1-0, then now you have the capacity to produce that. And some universities just produce those environments in a different way. I mean, Texas Tech, by all means. I mean, we're a tier 1 research institution, Carnegie Mellon Research Institution. There's no way around the fact that we place a high value on this, but it's also very outward a quality teaching institution as well. And so that's how they balance that. And all those factors in combination kind of create the recipe that we're talking about. Yeah, I would say if that's something you're interested in, then you've really got to be targeting the type of institutions that say, hey, listen, in every way, form, or fashion, we're going to show you that that's what we value the most. If you get one pub, you get tenure, right? If you get 2.5 on your teaching evaluations, we could care less, right? Just produce a Seminole piece. Oh. All right, so let's talk about some policy rationales. Okay, so we're going to introduce some new terms to this that kind of provide a framework for the way that we think about policy. All right, so let's first talk about the Pareto criterion. So a policy is a good fit if it makes one person better off without making another worse off. Okay, so again, if we think back to our discussion yesterday, we talked a whole lot about the sophisticated and the naive. We talked about the incentives of the two groups and how those incentives may create a benefit from policy, right? Okay, so that brings us here to Pareto. And Pareto's saying, okay, listen, if we need to introduce policy, then the goal should be to make the people that need to be made better off without making anyone worse off. All right, so this falls in line with very normative thinking, right? Just like the rational person. Nobody's rational. And I would say that no policy meets the Pareto criteria probably. But it is the ideal. So we know it's probably not realistic. And here's why. It's obvious. Many times making someone better off makes others worse off. We can think very basically, and by the way, I'm going to talk about things where you might think, I wonder what Dr. Browning thinks about those policies or mechanisms in our government. Don't go there. I don't really express those kind of thoughts in class. I just use examples, okay? So let's think about tax policy, right? If we say, hey, listen, our tax policy is progressive, which means that the more money you make, then the more tax you pay. And the reason for that is to help smooth the marginal utility of consumption for society as a whole, right? To eliminate disparities in fundamental societal needs that exist across an entire population. Okay, so let's just think about healthcare, and we'll use Medicaid as our healthcare example. Okay, so if we didn't have a progressive tax system, then for those that were less resourced, it would be very difficult to generate the tax revenue necessary to run a program like Medicaid, which would leave a portion of the population exposed to lower quality healthcare or no healthcare at all, based on their ability to afford that type of service. And so when the higher income individuals pay higher taxes, they basically subsidize the cost of that to a lower income population to help raise, again, the utility of society as a whole. Okay, so is there a group that's better off? Yeah, right. The lower income households that need access to healthcare are made better off by this policy. Is there a group that's worse off? Yeah, the higher income people that pay more taxes, right? The higher income people at some level would probably lobby hard, would organize well to minimize their exposure to higher taxes, because in our human condition of self-interest, it makes them worse off. Now, we're going to talk about externalities here in a second, right? And so is the higher income population willing to pay to minimize externalities, right? Are they willing to pay to reduce disease and transfer of disease and homelessness and things that may impact their lifestyle and well-being in an indirect way, but the impact can be real. I'll use Austin, Texas as an example, right? Austin, Texas is a beautiful city, especially by Texas standards. So if I go into Austin, Texas, and I go downtown on a date with my wife, right? It's date night. We're dressed up. We're going to a nice restaurant. Well, and I can't remember what they call it. I'm probably going to use the wrong word, but Austin is a safe haven city, right? That is set up to basically provide good conditions for the homeless. Okay. And so when you go into downtown Austin, you're going to bump into a bunch of homeless people. There's no way around it. And so that's a negative externality on my date, right? And so at some level, if everybody in Austin, Texas, which is one of the wealthiest cities in Texas, no questions asked, wanted to organize their resources in a way that would remove the homeless population from an area that they desired to participate in lifestyle activities in, would it be worth it to do that? It's going to cost them resources, but it's going to reduce the negative externalities in their life and improve their lifestyle indirectly as a result of that. Okay, so just because someone is made worse off by a policy doesn't mean that that group doesn't have opportunities and or benefits that are secondary to the main policy, right? Okay. So many are made better off and only slightly, or only some slightly worse off. Pareto's still violated. Okay. But we might be okay with that because society is much better off as a whole. Right? I can use school systems as an example as well. Right? A lot of our school funding in the state of Texas is funded through real estate taxes. And so people that generally have higher wealth and higher income live in more expensive homes, which mean they pay significantly more in real estate taxes than a lower income, lower wealth population, right? But a lot of crossover exists in a lot of our public school districts, specifically in Lubbock, Texas, right? You know, if you go to certain school districts and you drive around the school, you're like, how do this many people in Lubbock, Texas afford this housing, right? It's wild. And then you get letters from the school like, hey, listen, this is, what do they call it? I can't remember exactly what they call it, but basically this is a low income school. Like, I don't think so. But there's enough low income population at that school that the school automatically qualifies for free breakfast, free lunch. They get technology subsidies. There's all kinds of stuff like that. Okay, so there's a lot of people that are made better off by that. Okay, but some people are like, hey, listen, I prefer to pay less taxes because it restricts my consumption in other areas of my life at some level. And so even though the vast majority through the school system and the way it's funded are better off, some would still be worse off, which means that the Pareto criterion is violated, right? It's a very strict criteria. Okay, but there can be a compensation to the person that's made worse off. And so we can now come back and say, okay, well, if we integrate the tax systems across one another and we look at property taxes and how it impacts federal income tax, then the person that pays the highest taxes may get a subsidy through those taxes through itemized deductions that reduces their overall federal income tax liability. Okay, so there's some compensation there. And it would improve the outcome even of the person that potentially would consider themselves worse off through the real estate tax application in the state of Texas, specifically for certain school districts. So you can see the winding road that we go down when we think about these things. I'm giving pretty basic examples, right? And we're comparing them to an ideal. And we're saying, okay, if we can't achieve the ideal, then how do we keep harmony across the groups that are being impacted by different policies? All right, so that's where Calder-Hicks comes into play. Okay. And this is where we say, hey, listen, we got some alternatives here. If winners can compensate losers, then the policy is okay. All right. If winners can compensate losers, then the policy is okay. All right. Or if a potential loser can bribe a potential winner not to have policy, then you don't need policy to begin with, right? And so I'm going to make you better off in the absence of policy through a bribe at the end of the day. All right, so let's think about Lubbock, Texas really quick. This has been a little bit ago. You guys may be familiar with the Walmart that's on 114th and Quaker. And so 10 years ago, let's say whenever that Walmart was going in, that Walmart was right next door to a neighborhood where every house in the neighborhood was $750,000 or more, right? And they're like, I don't think I want a Walmart in my neighborhood. I don't want the traffic. I don't want to see a neon Walmart sign when I go in my backyard. Don't want it, right? And so you'd be like, well, what can they do to stop it? Well, Lubbock, Texas is a small town. May not feel like a small town, but when you start talking about wealth, it's a small town. And so somebody owned that land, right? Somebody owned that land. And the person that owned the land that Walmart was going on also was the owner of the land in that real estate development and had relationships with a lot of the people through real estate transactions, through business transactions, through investment transactions, through all kinds of stuff that lived in that neighborhood. And so a lot of people were saying, hey, listen, just don't sell the land, right? We can bribe you. You're a potential winner. I'm a loser. I'm going to bribe you not to sell that land, right? And so for a long time, there was a holdout to where the guy wouldn't sell the land to Walmart. Well, Walmart, they don't care. Like whatever your bribe is, mine's bigger. And so they basically came in and said, hey, listen, here's what we're going to do. And the two parties, the landowner and the corporation, negotiated. And if you notice that Walmart is basically buried on 114th and Quaker, right? So if you're driving down 114th, going east, on the north side of 114th is this neighborhood that I'm talking about. And when you're going east on 114th, you cannot see Walmart, right? And so in that case, Calder-Hicks is a great application, right? There was bribes and compensation between the two parties that made it to where the action was win-win for everyone involved in the situation. Now, that wasn't necessarily policy, but that was a societal transaction where there were going to be utility impacts to the Lubbock community, right? The greater Lubbock community is like, yeah, man, give me a Walmart that's more convenient. In a really safe part of town to where if I go at 11 o'clock at night, I'm not worried about any type of issues. You go to Lubbock, if you go to Walmart on Avenue Q at 11 o'clock at night, good luck. I think that's where our murder rate comes from. But if you go on 114th and Quaker, there's probably an ice cream truck sitting out front selling ice cream and snow cones at 11 o'clock at night. Not really, but that's the kind of contrast that you get. So the community of Lubbock's like, yeah, let's do this thing. And the residents in that neighborhood are like, let's not. So it was a really great example of this Calder-Hicks criterion where people can come together through compensation and bribes to get to a place of resolution where the vast majority come out on top. Okay, so like I said, winners be able to bribe losers to change policy, or losers should be able to bribe winners not to change. All right, so those are some just big assumptions that we make in relation to policy when looking at what are good policy alternatives to address an issue that's impacting consumer satisfaction. Okay.
It's a Caldor Hicks, or otherwise known as the win-win criterion. Oh,
Yeah. All right. Let's move on. Let's look at lecture 2. We're going to start lecture 2 the same way that we started lecture 1, with a little bit of review. All right. So these are things that we talked about. Why would we pay for advice?
If the benefit is greater than the cost.
Absolutely. That's exactly why. If the perceived benefit of paying for advice is greater than the cost. Now, what are we thinking about when we think about cost and benefit? This is one of the things we spent a little bit of time on yesterday, and we labeled this as a real complexity associated with this decision.
The cost of acquiring the specific knowledge that you require to make that decision.
Yeah.
It takes time and money to invest in acquiring that particular information.
Yeah. So really understanding what the trade-off is, right? Really understanding the cost of acquisition from an opportunity cost perspective versus the cost of paying for advice, which gets us to do we understand in this decision, right, where we're saying, hey, listen, is the benefit greater than the cost or not to pay a professional? And we have to be able to imagine at some level the present value lump sum of our lifetime utility with advice versus the present value lump sum of our lifetime utility without paying for that advice, right? And those are really, really hard things to estimate, right? But if we believe that the perceived benefit is greater than the cost, then we will pay for the advice in pursuit of more optimal outcomes. All right, what's the problem with financial knowledge? Spent some time on this yesterday too. Kathy just gave us one, by the way. It's costly.
The ability to transfer that knowledge to tangible application can be difficult. You can have financial knowledge, but not know how to apply it.
Absolutely, right? And so if you go back to Dr. Houston's framework, out of her 2010 paper on financial literacy, Lusardi and Mitchell were doing a whole lot on financial literacy, and they're like, hey, listen, we've got this down to 3 questions where we can really assess someone's general financial literacy by 3 questions. And Dr. Houston was like, that's great. I don't necessarily disagree with that, but we have to look at financial literacy as a 2-pronged dragon, right? Like there's knowledge and there's ability, right? I can have knowledge, but without ability, my knowledge isn't useful. And so when we're talking about overall financial literacy, we have to have the knowledge and the ability to apply the knowledge to our benefit. So excellent. What else? Kathy talked a lot yesterday about overconfidence, right? We can sometimes perceive our knowledge to be greater than it actually is, especially in more complex domains. And the last thing I'll say is just innate ability, right? Not only is financial knowledge costly, it's going to be more difficult for some to acquire than others, just based on innate ability. And so this is one of the big problems with education-based policy. There's an assumption in education-based policy that all else equal, people will be able to take the education and use it for their benefit. The all else equal assumption is a tough one, right? And there's a lot of things that aren't all else equal. The first one is the DNA of the person consuming the knowledge. Our innate ability varies person to person. Beyond that, our complementary education and experiences are going to vary as well. Some are going to have a whole lot of complementary education and experience, and some are going to have very little complementary education and experience. And so broad financial knowledge is difficult to achieve. And using that financial knowledge to create true literacy under the Houston definition is even more complex. Okay. And so it points to interventions that don't require a prerequisite, right? It points to interventions that say, hey, listen, financial knowledge is not a prerequisite to this intervention being successful. Regardless of your level of knowledge, this intervention should improve the outcome of people. Great example, automatic enrollment in employer-sponsored retirement plans. Doesn't matter how smart you are. You automatically get defaulted into employer-sponsored retirement plans in the vast majority of qualified plans. And the only way you get out of it is to negative elect. All right. Well, people generally don't like to make anything that's filling up a negative decision. And so the chances of negative electing out of that are pretty small. There's actually some pretty interesting research on how automatic enrollment and automatic savings rates applied to qualified plans impact saving over time across people with different characteristics, specifically financial knowledge, right? And the outcomes are almost identical, right? If we look at people over time that have similar incomes, but different levels of financial sophistication and even different time preferences, the outcomes that they experience from a total savings are very minimal, right? And it has just a lot to do with like, hey, listen, we're setting up an intervention that isn't dependent on your knowledge. So on the average, we see consistent outcomes. Kind of interesting. Oh, I missed one. So why do the rich use professional advisors? We got two effects in play here.
They tend to benefit a lot more.
Yeah.
From advice relative to people who are not rich. And again, I think yesterday we said they have the ability to appreciate the value of advice.
Mm-hmm.
Because the rich tend to be people who are a lot more educated than the average person. So they can evaluate and appreciate how valuable advice is to them. That might be the reason why they will want to pay for it.
Yeah, they have more at stake, right?
Yep.
If the marginal utility of advice would increase the effort for wealth, then it makes sense. If they have so much wealth, but by just one advice, it carries them forward several years exponentially, then why not invest in it?
Yeah.
So it increases their wealth either way.
Yeah, the momentum of advice is much greater, right? More at stake, greater momentum. Those things are both very true. Those are both demand side effects, right? They demand for those reasons. Justin, Tom, one of you guys have something?
Yeah, I was going to add also too, like the rich, they can afford it, right? So that's the other part of it. So unfortunately, I think an issue with our industry is like we would make the rich richer, right? So with the financial planning and knowledge that we have, where there's the other side, which I think policy comes into play, is to really like how do we help those that maybe not have the resources to pay for financial advice.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's certainly a supply side effect, right? Advisors decide to enter the market to supply what is being demanded to the population that is demanding it, right? So we have demand side effects that creates supply side effects, and we see that play out in the way that Justin's described it.
I was going to add, assuming they're high income, their opportunity costs for acquiring the information is higher?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good point. Y'all hear that?
I didn't say it again.
He said, so assuming that they're high income, they would be more willing to hire professional advisors because their opportunity cost for acquiring the information on their own is much higher. Their wage rate is much higher. And so that is a great point. All right, little more review. Why do we form a government?
Using the example of the naive consumer, the naive and the sophisticated consumer, whereby one is not taking advantage of the other, but reaching a leverage whereby when you have so much information, you don't use it to your advantage, neither do you take advantage of the consumer that does not really have that much literacy on finances.
Yeah, I agree, right? I'm gonna say that a little bit different, but I definitely agree. I'm gonna come back to it though.
So we're really, what we were saying yesterday is we're trying to increase the overall utility for the betterment of everyone. So we're trying to control the marketplace is what it said, I think yesterday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're basically pooling our resources. I'm gonna combine what you guys said. We're pooling our resources so that we can collectively pursue the things as a society we believe will maximize our overall satisfaction. Like that's why we form and organize governments, right? And sometimes it's not even governments, right? Sometimes it can be just groups. I'll use AARP as an example. It's a very powerful, organized group that has come together collectively to pool their resources to pursue the things that will ultimately provide the greatest benefit to that group. And they use their resources at some level, and this is going to sound like a negative word, but it's not, to coerce government into policies that benefit that group, right? Think about young people versus AARP. No chance, right? Young people, they're like, hey, listen, it'd be really awesome if there were policies in the government that had these features that benefit us. But what's the problem with young people? They're not organized and they have no resources. All right, compare that to the AARP group that is extremely organized and well-resourced. They have the ability to coerce. A collection of young people has no ability to coerce. And so a lot of times as a result of that, we'll see policy related to certain things that are very much in favor of this more organized, better resource group. Okay. So we can say groups, we can say governments, whatever we want to. But the reason that we form is to be able to collectively come together and coerce action for the greater benefit of the group as a whole. All right, so how do scientists add to the policy debate?
Okay, then do it through insights, that they produce, that generate, to be able to inform the policy decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. How do we inform as scientists? How do we inform as scientists?
I guess when we look at a scientist, they have observed specific behaviors.
Mhm.
They have made several assumptions, but it's things that have to be observable. So we're looking at policy informing that which we think we ought to do versus what they have typically observed, which may be deviant from what the policy really, rather what human beings should do. So they address the gap between what they observe versus what we ought to do.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so through research, we do exactly that, right? So scientists produce normative ought to be's, or the way the world should function, and then they test it, right? They test the normative to describe what's going on, right? To prescribe alternatives, and through that process, we can start to predict reactions to different policy alternatives, right? And then we can start to test the implications of policies that are in play and suggest alternatives, right? And so we become the lab in some way for observing the efficacy of policy. And then it's not just good to keep that in a bubble. Then we disseminate that through the publication, the presentation, and other processes associated with information dissemination. Good. What's the Pareto criterion?
Look at least one better and no one worse off.
Good. Yeah, policy is a great policy if it makes one better with making no one else worse, or all better with no one worse, right? It can be one or it can be all. All right, good. How about the realisticness of the Pareto criterion? Not realistic, right? So that introduces Calder-Hicks, which says what?
Both way.
Yeah, we can go win-win, right? So winners can bribe losers to support policy that benefits the winner. Okay, both are made better off. Or losers can bribe winners to avoid policy. Okay, so now the loser gets a win, the winner still wins, and all is well. Also not realistic for what that's worth, right? Now, it's more realistic than the Pareto criteria, but very rarely do you have true win-wins, especially on a consistent basis, right? Like, oh man, this is a great society that we live in. Everything is just win-win. No, right? But we can have a target and we can understand the implications for the different groups affected by our actions, and we can pursue these more ideal outcomes. All right, so I'm going to stop right here. Here's how I like to run class, by the way, when we're in these 3-hour classes. I like to go 50, take 10, go 50, take 10, go 50. All right. I don't know about you guys, but I get pretty bored after 50. And that's just my own personality. So I got to go refresh and come back ready to rock and roll. And so based on my personality defects, hopefully you guys get a benefit that goes along with that.
It's a win-win, yeah.
Yeah, so win-win. Thank you, Nick. I'm glad that you see it that way. I don't have to bribe you.
Yeah, no, right?
All right, cool. Well, we'll come back. I've got us at 46. Let's just meet back here at 9:56 and we'll keep it moving. Hey, great news, y'all. We're on slide 3 of 20 now. Okay. So, theoretically speaking, we would say that there's an argument for the marketplace being Pareto efficient, right? So notice I said theoretically speaking, I didn't say the marketplace is actually Pareto efficient, right? But from a theoretical perspective, one thing that we do observe in the marketplace is that things go to those that value them the most. All right? Things go to those that value them the most, right? So the most valuable gets treated as so, and the things that value the most valuable benefit from the acquisition of the valuable. Okay, and we can look at this in the consumer marketplace, We can look at this in a ton of different circumstances related to the overall market. Okay, so let's just give one example, which is the labor market. Okay, so the labor market, our example here is income goes to those who provide the most value to the market, right? So if you acquire the skills and experiences that produce value for the person searching for those skills and experiences, then you're going to be able to convert that human capital into income more efficiently than those that don't possess the same value characteristics. All right, so this is a good example of efficiency. Okay, everyone is made better off. Those pursuing value are made better off, and those that are valuable are made better off. Okay, and it trickles down the line, right? If I pursue a lower level of value, then I can acquire at a lower level of value, and everybody wins based on the level of value that's desired and the level of value that's provided by the marketplace. Okay, so I'll use a fast food restaurant as an example, right? I drive by Chick-fil-A almost every day with 3 kids, usually to spend money. And I always see their ad outside, like, hey, listen, now hiring, this is our hourly rate. Which I'm always like, dang, I might have to get a side job at Chick-fil-A. These guys are paying $21 an hour to hand food out of a window. And so my point being is you don't need a PhD to do this. Okay, and so Chick-fil-A says, hey, listen, this is the certain level of value that I demand. I'm going to go to the market to the people that provide that level of value at the highest rate, and I'm going to pay them $21 an hour. McDonald's like, we just pay 12, right? And so, hey, listen, I'm going to go to the market and pursue the person that provides the highest level of value at $12 an hour, and I'm going to benefit, and they're going to benefit. And so you could say that in the labor market, you could say that in the goods and services market. There's some efficiency there associated with this idea. Okay. But the question is, and this is where we're going to bring in externalities, what if others' utility is affected by this transaction process? Okay, and we could think of a lot of different circumstances where that would apply, but we would have an externality. And externalities can be both positive and negative. Okay, so just a recap in a shorter phrase of what we just talked about. We engage in transactions because there are 2 parties that stand to benefit, right? But both the buyer and the seller have the ability to benefit from the transaction. If that's not true, we're probably not going to engage in that transaction. Okay. Now, going back to information real quick, sometimes there's a perceived benefit that we believe exists that doesn't actually exist, or the level of perceived benefit is different in perception than it is in reality. Okay, so we can still engage in suboptimal transactions based on a miscalculation of the cost benefit trade-off. But generally speaking, if there's not a belief that there's a mutual benefit, then there's going to be no transaction that exists. Okay, but there could be other people outside the direct transaction that are impacted in the marketplace, right? And these people external to the transaction, again, could be made better off or worse off. All right, so let's say that, let's say that a donut shop builds on the retail space a block from my house, right? I love donuts. They're amazing, right? And so the donut shop is providing value to me, who thinks donuts are valuable. And I'm going to go to the donut shop and I'm going to buy me some donuts. Okay, well, what if other people are like, I really don't eat donuts, but the smell of that place every morning is amazing, right? The freshly fried sugar bread. Like I love going on my walks because it just enhances my walk experience by getting to smell that good smell early in the morning, right? That's a positive externality. The utility of a third party is being impacted in a positive way by the existence of that donut shop. And so they're going to have no opposition to the donut shop going into the neighborhood, even though they're not a customer. Okay. On the other hand, somebody could come in and be like, man, I gave up donuts a year ago. It's a huge temptation for me. Giving up donuts, though, I was able to lose 60 pounds. All right. And now they're building a donut shop in my backyard. I could see myself being negatively impacted as an externality by this shop going in. Now, they're probably not going to have any ability to impact whether or not that shop goes into that location or not. But they're certainly going to be made worse off through the temptation and potentially even the actions that exist as a result of that temptation, right? So very basic fundamental example of externalities, but that's how it works. Let's use, again, I'm not taking a political stance on this, but let's use oil fracking as an alternative example, right? Are there people in that transaction that are made mutually better off? Yeah, a bunch of people that would say, I'm in this transaction and we're both better off from this activity. Are there people that potentially experience negative externalities as a result of fracking? Yeah, right. There's some pretty good evidence that there are negative externalities that are part of that. And so from a policy perspective, how do we regulate oil production using fracking technology and practices so that the externalities that would potentially affect people in a negative way are limited as much as possible? Okay, so negative externalities oftentimes lead to policy implications and certain levels of regulation to limit the effect of the negative externality. Okay, so when this happens, our Pareto efficiency is impacted. Because before, right, we were talking about a marketplace where no one was made worse off based on value and value desire, everyone had a chance to win, right? Now, people external to the transaction can be made worse off by a transaction. Pareto efficiency goes bye-bye. And we may not even be able to get to call it a case, right? We may not be able to compensate and bribe in a way that is sufficient to produce a win-win. This is more realistic, right? So how do we get as close as possible becomes the question. All right, so if we're going to deal with externalities, this is how we get as close as possible from a theoretical perspective. Okay? We can monetize externalities, legalize externalities, or we can barter to basically avoid regulation and still get to a Calder-Hicks-like win-win situation. Okay, so monetize negative externalities. We can put a price on certain activities' negative impact on others. Here's a great example. The tax on tobacco products, specifically cigarettes, right? There's an astronomical tax on cigarettes, and it's because they produce negative externalities, right? They produce environmental things that people may not prefer, and there's even evidence to suggest that they may have health impacts if you're close enough to that negative externality over an extended period of time. Okay, and so the way that regulators deal with this, say, hey, we're just going to put a really hefty tax on that, and we're going to limit behavior through the monetization of the negative externality. Okay, or we can legalize them. Okay, we can allow affected parties to sue. Okay, so if you're in violation of a regulation that is intended to limit negative externalities, then the person negatively affected can sue you for their utility losses. And so it becomes a bonding mechanism, basically. right? If you fail to uphold your end of a contract, you become personally liable for the losses that others experience from your failure. Okay, we'll talk a lot about bonding a little bit later. Okay, but all these are regulatory applications to limit negative externalities in a society. Okay, or we could just agree to limit behaviors that result in externalities, right? So an HOA is a good example of this. All right. And so I think about a certain neighborhood in town that has a very strict yard maintenance HOA, right? And basically says, hey, look around. Everybody's yard looks awesome. And so to make sure that yours doesn't look awesome, we're going to limit your ability to behave in a way that might impact others in a negative way, i.e. you can't have an ugly yard if everybody else has a really good looking yard. If you're going to move into this neighborhood, you agree, right? You have a choice. You know the rules. And so they're setting up guidelines to limit behavior that results in negative externalities for the population in that neighborhood. Now, we won't talk about broader externalities like water use and the impact on availability, sustainability, and all that kind of stuff like that. We're just talking about for that group that immediately lives in that neighborhood. Okay, and so that gets us to Coase theorem. Okay, and Coase theorem is closely related to Calder-Hicks, and it says that there's no need to regulate since those affected losers, in other words, can bribe to reduce externalities. Okay, there's no need to regulate these situations because losers can bribe to reduce externalities. Okay, so let's go back to the HOA example. Right? Don't give me the rules, okay, to make me maintain my yard at a certain level. If I want my grass to be this tall instead of this tall, leave me alone. And here's how we're going to make this from. If you're my direct neighbor, I will pay to have your yard mowed. Okay, so if we have a square, and you want your yard, my neighbor, the person across the street from my neighbor, and the person across the street from me. Let's pretend like this person lives on a corner. Okay, I'll pay to have your yard mowed. You don't bother me. You're $250 better off every month for me paying to have your yard mowed. So we'll call it good. Sound good? Yeah, that's great. Your yard looks amazing. You just keep that grass however you want it, and keep sending that mowing guy over to my yard so that I don't have to pay for it. Right. So again, a goofy example, but an illustration of how bribes can be used to reduce the impact of negative externalities that result in more of a win-win.
I'm curious, how could that be applied? Just maybe an example. So I'm struggling with it a little bit. How could that be applied if I'm a practitioner, right? So if I'm, work for a big firm, how does that work in our industry?
Yeah, so let's say that a potential negative externality in the world of financial advice is the cost of information, right? And so one of the things we know is that people are going to demand information at different levels, generally based on how that information affects them and their understanding of the benefit of that information, right? And so the financial services industry uses disclosure very heavily as a policy intervention that is designed theoretically to improve the decision-making quality of the people making investment decisions, let's say. Okay? Well, information ain't free, right? There's a marginal benefit and a marginal cost to information. And so we could produce information in the form of a prospectus that is pretty dense and pretty thorough. And if regulation says, hey, listen, you got to provide a prospectus. Okay, well, that's good because there's value to that. especially for those that see that information as valuable. And so now the advisor can better serve their client through the provision of information. The client can make better decisions through that provision of information, and it's win-win. Unless we have a client that you're trying to serve that doesn't care about that information and is still required to pay for it through some form of fee structure, either associated with the way the advisor charges, or more likely associated with the way that the investment charges through the expense ratio, right? Okay. And so how can we then reduce that negative externality in the marketplace? Well, we could take the complicated, dense information and we could provide it in a way that was abbreviated and focuses on the most salient, important information, right? And so now instead of disclosing the entire prospectus, all I'm going to show you is 5-year, 10-year, and return since inception and fees, right? And so now we're looking apples to apples. Everybody can digest that. It's important to the decision of everybody. And so in this case, we could take a regulatory requirement of disclosure and we could simplify that in a way that it eliminated or reduced the externality to the people that have a lower demand for complex, comprehensive information.
Okay.
This isn't a great example of this because it actually is regulation. It's not an avoidance of regulation. But the Truth in Lending and Fair Credit, whatever the name of the act was, it came out in like 2010. That basically said, hey, listen, credit card companies, you have to disclose the impact of making a minimum payment versus something slightly higher than a minimum payment. Well, before that, they had disclosed, hey, listen, here's our fees, here's our interest rates, here's all the things that you would need to understand the difference if you could do the calculation, right? And regulation came back and said, that's not good enough, right? That's creating a negative externality where people are making bad decisions, even in the presence of information, because they don't have the sophistication of the time to process. And so we're gonna make it really clear through more salient disclosure the impact of your behavior. And the result of that is a significant smaller portion of people make the minimum payment on their credit cards now because they have an understanding of how the cost differs across the alternative. Okay. Now, what I will say in that example, it doesn't mean that either mutual fund companies or the credit card companies stop producing the more sophisticated information. They now just provide a complement to that sophisticated information that is more beneficial to the whole and reduces externalities. All right. So there are certain public goods. It is difficult to exclude certain portions of the populations from the use of those goods. Okay, so information is an example of a public good, especially in the age of technology that we currently live in. Right? Everyone has access to information. We're closer to complete information than we've ever been in the past. Okay, now it's just a matter of, do people know how to get to that information and use it effectively? Okay, so kind of in line with the example that I just started with, to Justin's question, is the public willing to pay for information about mutual fund quality? And what we would probably say is that there's variation in willingness to pay for this information. Okay, up to a certain level, everyone benefits. Beyond a certain level, there are differences in the marginal benefits to different people in the population based on the level of information provided. Okay, so if the cost is less than the benefit, I don't know why I wrote it this way on this slide, because if you read it backwards, if the benefit is greater than the cost, then we're going to require the provision of information through disclosure. Right? So again, the question is, will public pay for information about mutual fund quality? Yes, if the benefit is greater than the cost. Okay. Now we're going to read some papers a little bit later on this summer about the negative impacts of disclosure. I don't make you guys read a certain paper, and I wish I could. It's really, really long, so I didn't put it in the reading list. But if you do a search on Google Scholar, the title is something like disclosure as a smokescreen, right? Lobbying to the detriment of the consumer. It's something like that. If you just want to Google disclosure as a smokescreen, your likelihood of finding that paper is probably as high. Okay. But basically what it says is that large institutions will lobby for policy that basically requires a ton of information disclosure. And they'll use that as an opportunity to take advantage of the naive consumers in that marketplace, right? And the way it basically works in a nutshell is, hey, listen, I'm going to give recommendations and advice, whether it be financial, medical, repair-based, whatever the case may be. I'm going to give recommendations and advice that benefit me more than the consumer. And if the consumer comes back and says, hey man, this is nuts, I got taken advantage of, then the industry can come back and say, no, you didn't. We were required to provide a disclosure of full information based on the transaction or service or whatever that you were going to engage with, that you had and should have informed the decision that you made, right? And they do that knowing that the information provided is not going to be used to inform decisions, right? And so they lobby hard for disclosure policy. And so they're providing more information than the benefit that the information delivers, okay? And so there's no demand for that because the cost is greater than the benefit. Yet it's provided, it's part of our policy because people were organized and resourced enough to promote policy that looks like one thing, but's used for another.
That first statement, that an example that information is a public good, are you referring to all forms of information here? Because I in my thinking, why pay for something that is a public good? Yeah, so
Well, nothing's free, right? And so, you know, the production and provision of information isn't free in some way, form, or fashion. The public pays for that,
okay.
right? Now it may not be a direct, hey, listen, I sent you an invoice and you wrote me a check. But in some way, form, or fashion, we pay for the information that exists in the marketplace. Most of the time indirectly, but nonetheless, it bears a cost. So that's kind of what that.
Oh.
All right. So what if we incorrectly estimate the demand for information? Well, we'll either produce too little information, which means that there's not enough information that exists in the marketplace to inform good decisions, or we'll produce too much information and we pay for more than what we demand, and we have an inefficient allocation of resources towards information provision. Okay, so this is likely the case, that there will be an inaccurate estimate of demand. Now, the more domain specific our human capital is in a specific decision domain, the more likely it is that we'll be pretty close to demanding the level of information that we need to make informed decisions as a consumer base. The less domain specific human capital we have, the more likely it is that we will misestimate that demand and either require too little or too much information. There's been a big push in the financial services industry, towards what we were just talking about on credit card statements, right? Salient, easy to process and access information, right? Another big requirement that came out of the same act was that anyone charging interest had to report effective APRs, right? You couldn't report nominal APRs that didn't consider compounding. You had to report effective rates on all APRs so that people could look at interest rates on an apples to apples basis and make good decisions about the borrowing products that they were engaging with. And again, the effect of that was people would choose products that charge lower interest rates. And so there was a benefit to that type of disclosure across the board. All right, I'm gonna go on the soapbox. Get ready. I think one of our biggest issues in the financial services industry isn't the way that people give advice. It's the way larger companies train people to give advice. All right, so I'm going to name a company, and there's no judgment here. I'm just going to name a company, okay? Edward Jones. So when I was coming out of, and I'm going to give you an anecdotal example. So this is against what I said as a scientist, but it makes a point from a reg policy perspective, I think. 23 years old, I got hired to be an instructor of accounting at a university in Texas. And when I became a full-time faculty member as an instructor, I qualified for the benefits that that university provided. Right, so I had to make a decision from a retirement perspective. Are you going to participate in the ORP plan, which is the defined contribution plan provided by the state of Texas that requires a certain contribution rate and a certain matching rate from the employer, but gives you a lot of freedom in the investment choices that you make for those retirement savings? Or you could choose the teacher retirement system, which is the pension plan in the state of Texas. Okay. Well, I had no financial planning background whatsoever at that point in time. I had an undergraduate master's degree in accounting and a lot of overconfidence, right? And so like, I will take the ORP plan because I think I can outperform the pension plan over time. I got a really long runway. It seems like a good idea. Also had zero investment experience, so I had no idea what I was doing. Also didn't realize it was an irrevocable election. And so once I chose ORP, I had no ability to switch to TRS. All right, so I'm in ORP still. And I don't think it's going to be a terrible outcome at the end of the day, but that's more luck than skill. Let's be real clear on that deal. Who knows what the market's going to do? I could totally tank and wish I had that pension before it's said and done. But when I did that, the providers that worked with university employees came to knock it, right? So an advisor with Edward Jones came to my office and said, hey, listen, I'd like to help you with your retirement plan. You're young, you don't have any earthly idea what you're doing. I was like, you're right. He used that as the sales pitch to sell me. Later on, but it was like, I realized he was like the wolf in Little Red Riding Hood, like you're young and you're dumb and you don't know anything, so let's do this thing. And so we go in, and I'm going to be very honest about everything here, because again, I think it helps make the point. He puts me in 100% American funds, right? And a lot of American funds that I would say were in asset classes that are extremely efficient, right? I've got large cap American fund mutual funds that have a 5.75% load on the front side of them, high expense ratios for an asset class that couldn't outperform the S&P 500 if its life depended on it, right? Why on earth would I not have an index fund in large cap US stocks? All right, so I'm paying these really high fees on all these mutual funds. I don't know any better. And then I joined the PhD program in financial planning, and I go through all of my asset management classes and seminars and all that kind of stuff like that. And I read extensively the research and understand the curriculum at a pretty high level, much higher than the average consumer, through that information being beat into me. And so I go back to this advisor, and I was like, I just had a couple of questions for you, right? And at this point in time, I was such a small client that I had been passed off to a new advisor that came into town. And this guy's like, hey, listen, I don't have time for the bottom of my book. Let's get you started off on the right foot. You take the bottom, and I'm in the bottom. Okay. And so I've got a brand new person straight up. And I'm asking a lot of the right questions at this point in time. Right. I was like, so talk to me about these Americans. Right. Why? Why do you think it's important that I am in actively managed funds that charge these fees in asset classes? And they went in, and I was like, do you believe that these asset classes are efficient? And they basically said, no, I think we can beat these asset classes. And they said, here's why. And they gave me a regurgitated statement that was undoubtedly from their training, in my opinion, at this point in time. Undoubtedly. And so my gripe was, in the provision of information to me as a consumer, I was demanding a certain information. I was paying for information at some level, and the information that I was provided did not meet my needs or the level of demand that I had for information. And it wasn't because of the person, right? It was because of the institution, in my opinion. Now, I'm gonna qualify that with "in my opinion." The only thing this person knew to say to me is what they had been trained to say to me. And so I asked other questions, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on in this class as well. About just tell me a little bit about how you got into this. Like, what was your motivation? What was your background before? And it was totally unrelated to financial services. Now, let me also make a disclaimer. Can somebody in the financial services be extremely successful in financial services coming into the industry without a background in financial services? Absolutely, right? There are a lot of really smart people that are in our industry to serve people well and do so at a high level. No questions asked. No questions asked. But I also have a belief that our financial advice industry is set up at some level as a market for loans, right? If someone can enter an industry without any training or credentials, then the barrier to entry is too low, right? Because the impact that their advice is going to have on others is significant. All right, so there has to be raised barriers to entries, in my opinion. The even worse side of that is if some institution can go into the marketplace and target people without experience as perfect candidates to be trained to the institution's benefit without knowing better, that's a much bigger problem, right? And so, again, this goes back to the information we receive and how we demand that information, and based on whether or not how we demand that information impacts the quality of the decisions that we make and ultimately the outcomes that we experience in this case, the advice marketplace. And I would say that it definitely does. And so we have to simplify so that there's less variation across the board. One way to simplify is through more salient disclosure, right? What does the research say impacts investment outcomes? Well, the research says that most asset classes are pretty efficient. And the biggest thing that's going to impact the overall outcomes that we experience as an investor is going to be fees. Now, assuming that we're not doing crazy things like trying to time the market and different things like that, because those things can definitely have a massive impact on the success that we experience as an investor. There's lots of research that shows it. But for the typical buy and hold investor that's dollar cost average investing for long-term goals like retirement, probably the biggest impact on the success that they experience is going to be the fees of the investment products that they participate in, assuming that the vast majority of the market is, for the most part, efficient. All right, so then let's disclose based on fees, right? This asset class is efficient for the most part, as shown by research, same as the Surgeon General warning on cigarettes, right? Like if you smoke these cigarettes, your risk of cancer and other things is going to go way up. That's what research tells us. It's not my opinion. Research says that. Well, research also says in an efficient market, the biggest impact on long-term return is fees. And so let's disclose that. And let's be able to compare apples to apples fees so that people can make more informed decisions on the things that are going to impact their outcome in the most significant way. All right. Same thing for barrier to entry. That's a simple information policy, right? Are the information people receiving being delivered through vessels that are being trained based on science-based best practices for the provision of financial advice, yes or no? And there are easy ways to create barriers to entry where that is more likely than not true. And we reduce the variation of the type of advice and how advice is delivered through the different advice channels by changing provision of information and how it is ultimately delivered to the client, and more aligning that closely with how the client demands that information to achieve more optimal outcomes. All right, soapbox concluded. I'm not saying I'm right. One of the things that I love about PhD classes is number one, the variation of thought, right? That's what makes academics great. Number two is how we can bring things to the table from different perspectives, and we can all help each other think maybe in a different way than we have thought about some of these things in the past. And so some of these things are potentially challenging thoughts, but if it makes you think about things in a new way, then I think we're all better off at the end of the day as well. And so I always encourage on challenging thoughts for me, for you guys to come back to me with the other side of the coin for robust discussion.
Hey, since you opened it up, I do have a question, which is how else would advisors get trained if the firms weren't doing it, helping them?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Right now, not everybody holds a CFP, and I'm not necessarily saying everyone should hold a CFP, right? Kind of going back to the labor market that we talked about earlier. Some people are going to demand highly skilled laborers, and they're willing to pay them $200,000 a year for that skill and value that they provide. Some institutions are going to demand $12 an hour employees, and they're going to pay them for the value that they provide. And everybody's happy in both circumstances, right? And so I can say the same thing applies to the market for financial advice, right? Not everyone is going to demand the services of a CFP, because CFPs, theoretically speaking, are the foremost leaders in thought, process, and advice. And when you're the leader in that thing, you're probably more expensive than other alternatives in the marketplace. So the first comment I'm going to make, Justin, is related to the CFP, right? I think it is absurd. And that's a bold statement. So don't overthink that bold statement. That the CFP board does not require a degree in financial planning to hold a CFP. I think it's crazy. Now, another soapbox real quick. I'll make this one quick. The CFP board has a conflict of interest. Because they're both certifying the education for the programs that can provide CFP qualified education from a program perspective, and they're collecting fees on certification. So they have a lot of incentive not to restrict their ability to collect certification fees. As soon as you come in and say you have to have a degree in financial planning, guess what the number of test takers does? It plummets quick. And so there's some grandfather provisions, there's certain things that we can do to address that. But in degree programs, especially ones that have PhD or master's level programs, like I don't have practical experience, but my training is in research-based, science-tested best practices in the financial advice process. Right? And so if the people going into the market are receiving their education from programs that are trained in the research and science-based best practices, then that's very, very valuable to the uniformity of the way that we work with our clients to provide advice, right? Now let's work it on down the line. And let's say that we have a clientele that doesn't demand the level of advice that's provided by a CFP, then how does the market ensure quality outcomes across the board for those clients as well? I think that becomes product regulation, which certainly exists, right? And then I don't know the best way to word this. It sucks because we kind of try to do this, we just don't do it well. The thing that comes to mind is like suitability standards, right? So we have product regulation and suitability standards. All right, theoretically speaking, the hardest thing about a suitability rule is that it's a rule, right? What is our incentive with a rule? If you give your kids a rule, what do they do?
Push on it or break it.
Okay, good. What part of the rule do they push on? The lower boundary, right? Whatever the lower boundary of the rule is, to be in compliance with the rule is where your kid is going to live in relation to that rule. That's true for any rule in human nature. Very, very rarely, there are some of these people. If you're one of these people, thank you. But very rarely people say, hey, listen, this is the rule. And I want to allocate my time and my energy in a way to where I comply with this rule at the highest standard. It's kind of like an A. Do you want to make 100 or do you want to make an 89.5? I would encourage you to make an 89.5. It's efficient. If your goal is an A, then make an 89.5 because that's the most efficient path to an A. Well, if we apply this to the suitability standard and there's a range in what is suitable, then human nature is going to push to the lower bound of that range. Institutions are going to push to the lower bound of that range. And so it's a very difficult thing to do to better define suitability and build out training practices that would lead to more optimal suitability when making recommendations and so on and so forth. But I think something like that combined with a little bit more efficient product regulation, a little bit more efficient disclosure, then we could get to a place where it was difficult for institutions to train in their own best interest, right? Going back to the Edward Jones example, the advice that I was given was an institution training to its own best interest. I should have never been in an American fund, large cap stock mutual fund. Never, right? But it's suitable. It meets the standard. Should have never happened. So, those are the kind of things that, and I don't know the solution to the problem. And I'll full on admit that. But I do know that it should be probably restricted enough to where those types of activities can't be taught, even in the absence of the CFP. And then because they can't be taught, they can't be executed to the detriment of the client. Does that help?
It does, and I get your point. But I think about like, so fees are one thing, and we can like it's probably beyond the scope of the class, but also too, like we read a paper last semester in Dr. Hetman's class with money doctors, right? And they said the biggest reason why people hire financial advisors is to reduce anxiety. So yes, there is fees, but there's also too a lot of other things that advisors provide
Yeah.
for that fee that you get. And then you think about the Russell paper, the 5.3%, the Vanguard studies that like the additional amount that advisors provide. So with that, like in order for them to actually get that knowledge, oftentimes I would say have to go to a firm. And I hear you on the CFP, right? Having a financial planning degree, and that they did change it to where everyone has to have a degree, right? That was in 2008, I think, which I think is a big help. But I think that's also too very similar to, you could equate that to like a shortage, like my wife's a nurse. So there's a massive shortage of nurses that are out there. So with that, like if you only restrict it to only people with CFPs with the financial planning degrees, could you eventually get into a point that you'd have a shortage of financial planners, and that would actually hurt the greater good of like the financial public? I don't know. Does that make sense?
No, and it's really hard to predict, right? You'd either have a
Yeah.
shortage of financial advisors, or you would have an explosion of CFP degree programs, right?
Yeah, one or the other.
Yeah, it's really, really hard to predict how that goes down, but that would certainly be a concern, and a very valid one. Yeah, so these aren't easy problems to fix, but from a scientific perspective, like theory is what tells us that these problems exist.
Right.
Research is what tells us that these problems exist, and now we're better equipped to go out and say, well, okay, well, what puts us one step closer or a half step closer to a solution, to where we have a marketplace that's doing a much better job of producing value. And by doing a much better job of producing value is garnering increased trust. And by garnering increased trust is producing increased demand. And a broader population as a whole is experiencing greater benefit from high quality advice in relation to their finances. So good. The hardest thing about academics, I'm gonna be really honest with you, is anytime you're talking about the theory and theoretical solution, you don't get much below about 10,000 feet. And that's why I actually love the new structure of our program, to where we have a much bigger population of advisors, because you guys probably never go above 10,000 feet, right? Your boots on the ground, applied every day in every situation. And I love the perspective of that sounds great. And I always think about this in education too. That sounds great, but in reality, how do you do it? Because I don't see a path to do it. But when you have the two come together, then you have the ability to share perspective and really get to some more effective solutions. You know, I'll go back to, I'll use accounting as an example really quickly. And I think accounting is probably the closest profession to financial advice. I mean, it kind of falls under the umbrella of financial advice. Accounting is much older than financial planning. And I don't know where they started, right? You know, financial planning education really didn't come onto the scene until the mid 1980s. We're young. The first CFP was in the early 1970s. I mean, this thing hadn't been around for very long. But if you look at the efficacy of the accounting profession, it is very structured in the way that it operates, right? The CPA is the clear gold standard. To get a CPA, it's very rigorous and defined with regards to what those requirements are. It's heavily rooted in science-based best practices. Doesn't mean it's perfect, but it is an advanced, well-trusted, long-standing profession. Same can be said for medicine, same can be said for law, same can be said for certain types of engineering and architecture and those types of things. And we just don't have the runway that a lot of those things do. And so, like I said, who knows where they started? But that's where we are. We're kind of in the launch phase. And a lot of these things that I talk about from a theoretical perspective, I suspect will come into play as the profession matures moving forward. The question is, how do we balance some of the points that Justin is making with some of the points that I'm making to expedite that process effectively, right? Because we can expedite the process, but we could kill the effectiveness of that quickly. Or we could be really effective and go at it too slow to really make the impact that we want to make. All right, sorry about the soapbox. I like those kind of discussions, though. I think they're fun. Let's take another break. I've got us at 10:55, so let's meet back at 11:05, and we'll close this thing down. I promise I'm going to go faster. All right, welcome back. Turns out I can tell time. That's good news. Hey, Justin, you asked me a question that I didn't answer just a second ago. And it was about, what about the extra value and how do we get compensated for the extra value that we add in an advice relationship? I think that's a great point. And I think we've seen a lot of evolution in the way that advisors are compensated by their clients. And the evolution is nice because I think it's one that represents how a client wants to be served, right? It's not just, hey, listen, what investments do I choose anymore? When we think about the traditional investment advisor of 15 to 20 years ago, we were generally working with investors that had a lot of brokerage account money, potentially money that represented lifestyle beyond maybe their fundamental needs, right? And so it was easy to come in and say, hey, listen, my objective here is to maximize my resources through this investment account, through quality investment advice that isn't maybe going to have the ultimate impact on how I live my life moving forward. That's not so much the case anymore, right? From start to finish, people have become increasingly more responsible for the management of their resources in a way that's going to lead to the type of lifestyle that they desire. And part of what they seek from an advice relationship is the ability to sleep better at night, is the ability to have confidence that they're moving forward in a direction that is going to produce good results. And so as we go deeper into the relational aspects of our client interactions and how we can provide services that impact their life in a broader way, then we have to have compensation strategies that address that. Right? We're still going to do the other things. The other things have become a little bit easier to implement based on advances in technology. Now, the hard part of financial advice is the art of financial advice, right? Getting people to do what you tell them to do, getting people to feel good about it, getting people to stay the course over long term, reducing stress, improving lifestyle, improving life quality. All of those things are a big part of that. And so I think that, you know, as we see more flat fee based compensation strategies, as we see more retainer based compensation strategies, all of those things basically communicate like, you got me. I'm not just here to tell you where to put your retirement money. I'm not just here to tell you that you're not saving enough, or that you're saving too much, or you're not spending enough, or you're spending too much. Those are parts of our relationship, but the services you've engaged me for are broader than that, and the benefits are as well. So there's got to be a way for me to be compensated in those ways. So I think that our industry is evolving well from that perspective, and it's important that we do. Because, another point that we could make is that good advisors have to demand this profession, right? There has to be a demand from high quality human capital for this profession. And part of what's going to lead high quality human capital to demanding the profession are good opportunities for compensation, right? And so with or without a CFP, there have to be good opportunities for compensation to attract good people to the industry. So thank you for making that point for a question, Justin. I wanted to make sure that I came back and addressed that a little bit.
On the flip side of that, let's say the compensation is given. Let's take what we currently have. How about a strategy to broaden or to increase the demand by pitching to people out there who are not really interested in advice about the extra benefits beyond, let's say, portfolio outcomes. I feel that is where the difficulty is. If we can broaden the demand base, then even given the fee structures we have now, if we maintain them, then the people who are in there may end up making a lot more money because they have a lot of people where they can duplicate their resources. So my thinking is we need to advice goes beyond the benefits, goes beyond portfolio outcomes. How do we sell the other outcomes? How do we produce good research that will convince people out there that this thing goes beyond just portfolio outcomes? I feel that is where the difficulty is.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I think what your question is how do we communicate our value proposition?
Yeah.
And how do we quantify that value to produce more demand?
Yeah.
To from the population, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to kind of answer your question. I think we have two things that significantly limit the demand for financial advice from the consumer, right? Which indirectly is going to impact the demand for financial advice from the high quality provider, right? And so, in other words, if we got really smart people going into different industries, why aren't more of them coming to the financial advice industry? All right, so the two things that I think are our biggest demand limiters are overconfidence. People are like, I can get access to the information and I can improve my decision enough through the information that I acquire to avoid the cost of paying an advisor, right? It's cheaper for me to do it that way.
Yeah.
Well, maybe on the front side, what people are having a hard time doing is what we talked about a lot already, right? They can't compare the present value of lifetime utility from hiring an advisor versus not hiring an advisor. And so they don't know how much they're losing on the backside from suboptimal decisions through self-guided advice. So that's a big demand limiter. Related to that is trust, right? I would be more willing to pay you a higher price if I trusted you. And we'll talk about this a lot more in a future lecture, so I'll give you a very abbreviated discussion on this right now. Variation in quality leads to reduced trust, right? I'm going to use the auto mechanic industry as an example. I, as a consumer, have no earthly idea if the auto mechanic that I'm going to is a high quality mechanic that is working to produce an outcome with my car that's in my best interest, that they get compensated well for based on their expertise, or if they're filling me full of load of crap and charging me more than I should be charged for things that I may not need. I don't know, right? So there's variation in providers in the marketplace. As a result of that, I have reduced trust every time I go into that. And so reduced trust from variation in quality of advice in the marketplace probably pushes people more towards self-directed financial advice and decision-making and reduces the overall demand from the marketplace at the end of the day. And so an indirect way to accomplish what you're talking about of packaging up our value proposition is we have to reduce the variation of service provider in the marketplace in some way, form, or fashion, or we have to be able to delineate across quality, right? If I need neurosurgery, I go to a neurosurgeon. I know who they are. I don't go to a nurse practitioner. There's a very clear delineation in the medical field with regards to who is qualified to do what. And I can choose my provider based on their sophistication and my need as it relates to that sophistication. And I can do it very clearly, right? In the financial advice world, not true, right? In fact, I think we've set up a system in some way to create confusion. I can get a business card that has 48,000 letters behind someone's name. I'd be like, that's pretty good. That's 48,000 letters. I'm surprised they fit all that on one business card. So if letters equals quality, then I'm going with this guy. Or I can have a practitioner that is a CFP and be like, well, she only has 3 letters behind her name. And so she can't be as good as the guy over here that has 48,000. Well, the 48,000 could be very low marks to accomplish. And there's no ability for the consumer to distinguish. And so they choose the 48,000, get crappy advice, tell their friends about it. Demand is reduced. There's no clear delineation on a broad-based scale in relation to quality. And so there has to be a clear delineation, a clearer communication of value add proposition so that people can make informed decisions based on the level of sophistication that they need to engage with. All right. Equity versus efficiency. We agree that utility equals happiness. $100 means more to a grad student, a little bit less to a professor, not much, a little bit less to a dean, because the marginal utility of consuming an additional unit is less as resources increase, right? I use this example with my undergraduate students all the time. I'm like, hey, listen, before you came into class, I taped a $5 bill under every chair in this classroom. It's a lie. I don't have that many $5 bills. But they freak out. They're like, yes. They go nuts. If I had a classroom full of deans and said, hey, listen, I taped a $5 bill under your chair, they're like, I'm not even gonna waste the time to look under my chair. I think you're probably lying. And so the marginal utility of consumption from an additional unit decreases as our resources increase. Okay? And so if that's true, we have to understand the difference between equity versus efficiency. Equity recognizes the social benefit of spreading resources, right? And so let's go back to tax policy. Tax policy is a very equitable policy, okay? I'm going to take resources from the highest resource group of the population, and I'm going to transfer those resources to the lowest resource group in the population. And the reason I'm doing that is because the utility gained from the additional consumption that's now available to the lowest resource population is much greater than the utility lost from the high resource population. And so if that's true, the average elevation of utility provides a significant societal benefit. That's equity, all right? We'll come back to this. Let's talk about what efficiency is real quick, right? Efficiency is allocating resources to the things that produce the most value to society, okay? Efficiency is allocating resources to the things that provide the most benefit to society, the most value to society, okay? So an example of efficiency is investing in technology, okay? Technology provides a ton of value to society. And so people that value technology will invest in technology. And as a result of that, the technology sector is able to advance at a rapid rate. Okay, so that's an efficient allocation of resources. All right, so is information policy equitable? We're going to take information and we're going to distribute it to those who have the most restricted access to that information. It kind of sounds like it may be, but the reality is a lot of information policy is not equitable for two reasons. The people that we're transferring the information to don't understand the information well, right? Lack the literacy to interpret the information. Therefore, they don't have a demand for the information. If they can't process and as a result don't have a demand, but still have to pay at some level, that's not good, equitable policy. Information policy is far more likely to benefit the more sophisticated. Okay, so this is actually an example of efficient policy. I am going to produce equity or information policy to benefit the most sophisticated so that they can make more informed decisions and advance the economy through increased resources in that economy. Okay, but it's not equitable, more likely than not. Okay, we may have better approaches to equity with less resourced, higher margin utility households. All right, so we talked about efficiency, income is based on value. Those that provide the most value receive the most resource allocation. And we see that in the marketplace, right? Walmart versus Kmart. Walmart did a much better job of providing value. Kmart's gone, right? Lexus versus the Pontiac Aztec. Pontiac doesn't exist. If you find an Aztec on the road, take a picture. I'd like to see it. That's kind of like seeing Bigfoot. And Lexus is thriving, right? So resources flow efficiently to the things that produce the most value. And the things that produce value continue to exist, and the things that don't produce value cease to exist. Okay. All right. So the goal of policy is to provide a marketplace where resources are efficiently used so that we can maximize resource availability within the society. And then distribute those resources in some way that considers the overall utility of a society by creating regulation that promotes. Okay. So they both matter, right? We want to create efficiency through good resource allocation. But as we produce increased resources, we want to consider equity to elevate the utility of the whole. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the perfect information frontier. This is a set of consumer goods or services that the consumer should consider. All right. And they should consider only a certain set of products and services because they're fully aware of the price of those products and services and the quality of those products and services. Okay. So when that's true, I'll never pay more than the lowest price for a certain level of quality, or I'll never choose a good or service that has a lower quality for a given price, right? I'm only choosing the goods and services that have the maximum relationship between those two characteristics. Lowest price for a given quality, highest quality for a given price. Everything else ceases to exist. Right? That's very efficient. Right? That's very efficient marketplace. In that way, we're going to produce a lot of resource in that marketplace because resources are flowing to only those things that provide the most value. Okay. So quality, if we define it, is the expected utility of a product. All right, so how could we construct the perfect information frontier? Right, I can give you this, but we'll just look at an example. right? You pick the product with the lowest price and remove all products that have the same or lower quality. Okay, so if I have a price of $1 and a quality ranking of 4, right? It produces 4 utils, then I would never choose a product that costs $1 that only produced 3 utils, right? Or I would never choose a product that produced 40 utils but cost $1.50, right? The combination of $1 to 4 utils is the best combination for that particular product in the marketplace. Okay. And the list goes on and on. So you can read this, but let's do it. Okay. All right. So we have products A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and I. And we have quality, measurements, and price for each one of those products. So if we wanted to start this, the easy way to do it is just to go to the lowest price. Okay, so let's go and find the price of $1. Right, there it is with product I. Okay, is there anything that provides that quality at a lower price? No. Right, so product I is by default going to be on the perfect information frontier because it provides a quality of 3 at the lowest price. Okay, so it's on. All right, let's go to the next price. We have a price of $3. Is there anything that provides a quality level greater than 4 for that price?
No.
No, it's on. Okay, we have a price of $4. Is there anything that provides a quality level of 3 for a lower price? Yeah, so I'm never going to consider product G. It's out. It's worthless. Okay, we could keep going with this. You guys understand how this works. And so if we could create a perfectly efficient marketplace, then consumers would have full view into the decisions they were making, and they would only make optimal decisions. Okay, is this realistic? No, right? People are always buying things that have lower quality than what they should for a given price level, right? People are always buying things that have a higher price than they should for the quality level, right? We're always misallocating resources in the marketplace, okay? Now, because the market does tend to be efficient, these things over time will weed themselves out, but it doesn't do this perfectly, okay? The more complex, the more difficult it is to acquire information, and the more difficult it is to process acquired information. So the more likely it is that we'll have market inefficiencies. The more transparent a market, the more likely it is that we'll have an efficient market, especially absent of regulation, right? In complex, opaque markets, the perfect information frontier is going to look like crap if we don't have regulation that limits people's ability to come into that market and take advantage of consumers. Okay, but with regulation, even in opaque markets, we can have more or relatively efficient marketplaces because we limit the provider's ability to create poor price quality correlations with their deliverables in the marketplace. Okay, so there should be a correlation between price and quality, right? And it should be positive. The higher the price, the higher the quality. The lower the price, the lower the quality. But that's not always true, right? And so let's think about a marketplace that is efficient. Somebody give me an example of a marketplace where, generally speaking, the price you pay is positively associated with the quality of the product that you receive. All right, I'll give you one. The restaurant industry, right? Pretty efficient marketplace. right? The price you pay, more likely than not, is going to be pretty well associated with the quality that you receive. And if that's not true, those restaurants cease to exist pretty quickly. If you're charging too much for the expected level of quality for that price, people immediately stop going, right? The other way around might be more likely to be true. People charge too little for high quality in some cases, but demand increases, and those owners generally increase their price based on the elasticity of demand for the product that they're producing. And so that market corrects itself pretty quickly. All right. So give me an example. This one's going to be easier for what that's worth. Give me an example of an inefficient market where price quality correlation is less known.
Our industry.
Okay, good. Thanks, man. Yeah, I tee you up. Justin, what were you going to say?
Well, kind of like that, used cars, for example.
Yeah, great example, right? So Innocent said the financial advice industry. We won't talk about that one anymore. And Justin said the used car market, right? Great example. Both are what I would say are either experience goods or credence goods, right? An experience good is one where I don't know the quality until after the purchase, and it may be a long time after the purchase. A credence good is one where I never know the true quality or the price quality relationship for the good or service that I bought. I just hope I did good. And so I think both of the examples that you guys gave are great examples of experience and credence markets. And it's very difficult to assess price quality relationship. And because of the difficulty, it takes a lot longer for these marketplaces to correct, to increase the efficiency of the marketplace. There's no incentive to correct, right? Incentives are huge. Is there an incentive for the used car dealer to buy higher quality cars and charge a more competitive price and reduce their margins if they don't necessarily have to? Yeah, there's a moral incentive to do it. But if you remove the moral incentive, the pure incentive is non-existent. The pure economic incentive is to maximize my own utility. And the way I maximize my own utility as a used car salesman is to sell every car at the highest margin that I possibly can, if the consumer can't tell the difference. Now, if the consumer can tell the difference, then I got a different thing, right? I start to impact my reputation. As my reputation declines, then the demand for doing business with me also declines. And now I'm impacting my utility in a negative way. But if the consumer has a really hard time telling the difference, the economic incentive is low.
Could that be similar to the bond market as well, the secondary bond market
Mm-hmm.
in our industry? Like the markups, like your bonds could be all similar, but the markups are considerably different.
Yep, that's exactly that's a great parallel for the market that we operate in. Yep. All right. So good examples. So when we have low correlation, we have a large number of products that don't meet the perfect information frontier criteria, right? They offer too low quality for a price or too high price for the quality. And the distance between products that do meet the PIF criteria is greater, right? What we would see on a really efficient market where all products and services meet the criteria for the perfect information frontier is this really linear thing, right? Like I can buy, and I don't even know, I can buy a really crappy pair of shoes for $5. Cool, I know I'm buying a crappy shoe and I'm willing to pay the price for it. That's what I mow my grass in. Right? I could buy a better shoe for 20. I could buy a better shoe for 100. Now, at some point in time, branding kicks in and the actual quality doesn't vary that much, but the price does. Now I'm paying for something else. I'm not paying for quality. I'm paying for status. I'm paying for recognition. I'm paying for something else potentially, right? But it's pretty linear in an efficient marketplace. In an inefficient marketplace, we have dots on this perfect information frontier that are all over the place. And it's really hard to know if I'm looking at a dot that is an efficient relationship between price and quality, if I'm looking at one that is not. And so that's how we observe the difference between efficient and inefficient marketplaces from a graphical perspective, right? And when we have an inefficient market or there's low correlation between price and quality, we don't get what we pay for. We have a misallocation of resources that leads to utility losses, right? I would have spent my money differently had I known better. And as a result of spending my money in an inefficient way, I lost out on resources that could have produced more satisfaction. Okay? Which leads to an incentive to investigate quality. Right? Now, whether or not we do a good job investigating quality as a consumer is to be debated. We'll talk more about that later, but in low correlation markets, it's much more likely that we'll engage in research before making a purchase because we want to minimize utility losses from paying something that doesn't match our preferences. Okay, so we have more incentive to research it. Yeah, so why is there lacking correlation between price and quality? We can say some of this is just due to a lack of consumer sophistication, right? That leads to an inability to assess quality. That can be further exacerbated by technical complexity, right? I'm more likely to be ignorant when the decision that I'm making is more complex. So even if I wanted to do research, the likelihood of me improving my outcome through research goes down, right? And so what do I do in this case? If I can't improve decision quality in an inefficient market because of complexity, then what do I choose to do? I choose not to participate. The risk is too high, right? The risk is too high. The variation in outcomes is so great that my risk-averse preferences are going to lead me to reduce my participation. That's all there is to it. And so that is a theoretical explanation for why people would choose not to engage more consistently with financial advice, right? If we have low correlation between price and quality in the financial advice marketplace and low consumer ability to assess quality and the relationship between those two things, based on the complexity of the marketplace, then people just choose not to participate. There's too much risk or too much perceived risk, at least.
How about the alternative that what people will be willing to offer will depend on their expectations of quality. If I expect the quality to be low, then I will not be willing to pay more for it. Isn't that instead of staying away completely from the market, I would say, hey, this is what I'm willing to offer you because I'm not sure about the quality. I'm just going by that paper by is that Kellogg, the lemon something, because that was this proposition. Yeah, that when you have quality uncertainty, people form expectations, and if the expectations are very low in terms of the quality they expect, then what they are willing to pay will be quite low. Yep. Yeah. So
what's the effect of that, right? So in essence, saying, hey, listen, maybe they still participate, even when they can't assess quality because of technical complexity. They still participate, but they only participate at the lowest price.
Yeah.
All right, that's true. Good. So what's the effect of that?
I think from his paper, it drives away people of good quality.
Right.
Because
now I've only got low quality providers in the marketplace.
Yeah.
Because they're the only ones that don't have enough skin in the game to lose out from charging low prices.
Yeah.
Anybody that offers higher prices, but the consumer can't tell if it's a better quality or not, gets phased out. That's bad. And so it becomes a true market for lemons.
Yeah.
If the correlation is too high, or the correlation is too low between price and quality. Good. Successful branding can change this a little bit, right? And the reason I put successful branding on this slide is because participants in the marketplace, providers in the marketplace, can still attract business even with low price quality correlation through successful branding. The perception of quality, right? Is a Nike shoe a higher quality than an Amazon shoe that costs $30 that somebody knocked off, right? I can go into Amazon and be like, dude, those shoes are sick. How you pronounce the name of the shoe? I have no earthly idea. No clue. Where was it manufactured? How was it manufactured? I have no idea. Is Nike a better shoe at $120 than this shoe is at $40? I have no idea. Let's say that it's not. Why do I pay $120 for Nike? Branding, right? And so in this shoe marketplace where there's low price quality correlation in some way, form, or fashion, which I just used the opposite just a second ago. So forgive me for coming back and using the example differently. Successful branding can make all the difference in the decision that I make at the end of the day. All right. And in markets where there are low price quality correlations, there is a high cost of finding out the actual correlation that exists across the different offerings. Okay, so I'm going to research a financial advisor, doing a really good job interviewing and researching and determining the financial advisor that best suits my demands is going to come at a higher cost in a low price quality market. In a high price quality market, I can go on. Do you have the CFP? Do consumers rate their experience with you well? Cool. You charge more, but the value's more. I'll pay. Becomes much less costly to identify that relationship. All right, so how about the market for mutual funds? Let's just use the S&P 500 mutual funds as an example. Are there quality difference in, speak generally for me, right? You, especially guys practitioners, if I'm wrong, be like, this is a bad example, man. But generally speaking, is there a difference between the quality of S&P 500 index funds or any S&P 500 fund? Not generally. It's a commodity for the most part. Now, are there some sucky fund managers? Probably. But on the average, commodity. So there's not a whole lot of quality difference. So the only thing that we should be competing on is price. And because there's no quality difference, should there be a lot of price variation? Nope, but there is. In some cases, now it's getting tighter, for sure, but there's still price variation. A sophisticated consumer should come in pretty much and only buy the commodity at its lowest price. Right? Here's the reality. In 2007, investors paid $206 million more than the low price option and expenses for S&P 500 index funds. That's in 2007. I haven't seen any research on this since then, but if you extrapolate that out to today, just based on inflation and market participation, I bet that number is bigger, and probably to a magnitude that's economically significant. So it's just kind of wild to think about how complexity impacts the consumer's ability to make informed decisions. And so if complexity impacts a consumer's ability to make informed decisions, then how do we deal with that interference so that there's less variation and better outcomes for participants? All right, so let's look at an example with smart people. All right. So this Choi, Lakeson, and Madrian paper is surveying people at Harvard University from 3 different populations. Okay, we have a student population, a staff population, and a faculty population. All right, and they're basically, this kind of goes back to the story that I told earlier as well. Okay, they're conditioning people on different criteria associated with mutual fund investments. Okay, to start off with though, they define what a mutual fund is. Okay, and so they bring these people in and they give them a baseline that's consistent across all 3 samples. Right, so everybody got the same definition of what a mutual fund is. Everybody got the same definition for what an S&P 500 index fund is. And so they all come into this thing with the same background from an information perspective. Okay, then they condition the groups on different criteria associated with this. They come in with one group and say, hey, listen, let's talk about fees. Right, so I'm going to give you the fee schedule for a different group of, or a set of mutual funds. We're going to talk about the impact of fees on mutual fund performance. And this is what we're going to disclose to you in your decision-making process. Okay. And so this is just how they illustrate it out in the exam. Then they come back and they condition people, a different group, on returns. Okay, so here are the returns over certain periods. This is how we're going to define the parameters for which that you might make a mutual fund investment decision. Okay, and so again, oh, we have more than one group. I forgot that Wharton was involved in this as well. Okay, and so then they did an experiment and said, hey, listen, which fund would you choose? And they just laid it all out there, right? They said, hey, listen, here are the funds. Here's when the fund was conceived. Here are the requirements to invest, the expense ratio, the load, the overall fee. And then they also disclosed some returns in a secondary analysis. But just looking at this fee analysis, all right, they have a control group which didn't receive any fee or return conditioning. Then they have the fee treatment group, the return treatment group, and the FAQ treatment group, where they just talked about, hey, here are the frequently asked questions in relation to this. Well, across Harvard staff, MBA students at Wharton and Harvard, what they basically see is that the fee treatment group chose the funds that, lo and behold, have the lowest fees. Right? So how they disclose the information to smart people affected how those people made their decisions. Okay, so if you're just looking at the bottom, there's some statistical tests that show the significance and differences and all that kind of fun stuff like that. In a nutshell, because we're not too worried about this in this class, there are significant differences in the fee levels across the groups based on the treatments that they receive. Okay. All right. Now we asked, what is most important? All right. And we have the control group, we have the fee treatment group, we have the return group, and the FAQ group. All right. Now, what's pretty interesting is that the level of importance that they assign to the different factors in their decision are very closely to the treatment that they closely related to the treatment that they receive. Right. So when we say, hey, listen, here's one criteria, right? Pick a mutual fund based on one criteria. We see that the treatment impacts how they evaluate that one criteria. Then we come back and say, here's a bunch of criteria. Right? How do you rank these things now that you're introduced to more than just the one thing? Right? If you had more choices, would you have chose differently, in other words? And what we see is that the people are very tied to the importance of their treatment when ranking the importance of a variety of characteristics related to mutual fund investment. Okay. Now we do see with fee treatment, right? They still place a pretty high value on performance, right? They rank that number one. Performance over the past year is number one. Fees are number two, right? The return group comes in and says performance really important, performance really important, fees not unimportant, but not nearly as important as returns. And so just kind of an interesting thing. We see that from staff, we see that from students alike, right? So it's not just the population that makes the difference. When we look at a variety of populations, we see that treatments have pretty close to the same effect on decision making. And so this is good, right? This is good to know. Now, this isn't a definitive answer to all of our problems. It's evidence in relation to a theoretical expectation based on a research question, but it's informative, right? It tells us something really simple. Disclosure is important. The provision of information and how that information is provided is important. It will impact decisions that impact outcomes. And so if we're going to set up policy initiatives, then we need to set up policy initiatives from the evidence and other research that we'll see that provide information in a very simple way in relation to the most important factors, right? Simple way in relation to the most important factors to long-term overall outcomes. All right, so here's an extension of this that's kind of interesting. And so let's just look at this. How likely is it that you would change your decision if you consulted a professional investment advisor? All right. So we see that as people increase their likelihood of changing their decision from consulting a professional advisor, their average fee based on what they selected in the experiment was higher. All right. So what the authors draw from this is that the most sophisticated person or the most sophisticated people in the sample, regardless of their treatment, focused on the most important factor, fees. And the people that are least likely to change are likely the most sophisticated. And the reason they're not changing is because they know they've already made their decision on what matters the most. All right, so how confident are you that the decision you made is the right one for you? Very confident to not at all confident. Again, we see some linearity in the relationship between their confidence and the fees associated with what they chose. What this is basically saying is that domain-specific financial literacy also matters, right? So for the people that are smart, it probably doesn't matter too much how you disclose this information, right? For the people that are less sophisticated, how you provide this information is extremely important. All right, and then how knowledgeable of an investor would you consider yourself to be? Very knowledgeable, relatively knowledgeable, again, much lower fees. And as that sophistication decreases, we see a very linear pattern in fees as well. Interesting paper. Choi, Leibson, and Madrian are authors that have a very heavy focus on behavioral financial decision making, especially around investments. So they have some really interesting papers out there on the influence of bounded rationality on decision quality for the household level investor. All right, let's hit these last 4 slides real quick and then we'll call it a day, okay? All right, so what is search and when will we search? Okay, so search is a consumer's effort to obtain market information. We can think of this as an investment, right? Because we know that the acquisition of information is going to have an opportunity cost. Okay, so how much effort we place into the acquisition of information through search is going to be based on the cost benefit of that search. Okay, so we're willing to sacrifice some current utility for future long-term total utility gains. Okay, the bigger we perceive the benefit of search to be, the more likely it is that we'll search and the more thorough we'll search. The less the perceived benefit of search, the less likely it is that we'll search and the less thorough the search. Okay, and so we're willing to sacrifice utility based on the perceived benefit. And the greater that benefit, the more we engage. Okay, and so we know the opportunity cost of a search is what we've already looked at in relation to information. And we know that we'll do this if we believe there's a benefit to that activity. Okay. Now, in addition to time cost, there might also be transaction cost. So time cost, again, opportunity cost, transaction cost. What might I have to pay to get access to the information that's going to better inform me? Okay. And there's, in some circumstances, things that we will pay for to improve decision quality. The benefit from search is better efficiency in our transactions, right? Better price quality correlation. So if we're thinking about investment selection for our portfolio, we'll pay lower fees for a given level of quality, or we'll get higher quality for a given fee, measured by some of these types of things. Now, if we're going to estimate the benefit of a search from an investment perspective, right, we would say, all right, numerically speaking, monetarily speaking, how much more resource did I generate from the assets that I had invested by making quality decisions, right? Now, that's hard to say, right? Because we don't necessarily know what the outcome would have been of a lesser quality decision, but we can sometimes pick that up in average return differences, right? So the average return of this segment of the marketplace return, whatever, because of my search activity, my net return after fees is this much higher than the average of the consumer experience. I don't necessarily know what my individual difference might be, but I can compare it to some type of benchmark that might show the benefits. Okay, and overall, the quantifiable benefit is the present value, the lump sum present value of all outperformance from improved choice over time. I like to think about this almost like the college decision. I'm going to research the institution that has the degree program that allows me to reach my education goals and launches me off into the professional workplace with the most efficiency. And then I can say, all right, quantifiably speaking, my income trajectory from my educational choices is this instead of this, right? And the present value difference in that trajectory is astronomical. And so it was worth it for me to search for the educational institution and program that I decided to participate in comparison to other alternatives. All right, so we're going to talk a lot more about search in our future lectures. I'm going to take a much deeper dive into the market for lemons over the next couple of lectures. And so just as a reminder, I like starting and finishing with reminders. These are just as much for me as they are for you. Recorded lectures tomorrow and Monday. We will not be in class together. Just so you know, I set the Zoom to be available every day. And so if you can see the guts of the Zoom link, which you may not be able to, it's set up for every day. Disregard that, right? Just listen to what I'm telling you. And then we'll reconvene together on Tuesday to finish up lecture 5, talk about the midterm, and to answer any questions that you guys have that we didn't have a chance to discuss from lectures 3 and 4. Is that cool? Okay. Went over a
Question on
lot.
the presentations. I think you're going to have a list for our presentation order.
Yep,
Have you
that'll be
created
available.
that?
today. I'm sorry, Justin, I interrupted.
Oh, I was just gonna ask if you've created that.
Not yet, but I will post it today.
Okay.
Yes, sir. If you know you have a presentation conflict, where you send it to me like, hey, listen, I am going to be MIA on this day, not here in person, not available on Zoom. Let me know and I'll make sure not to schedule you for that. But other than that, I'll just go totally random. All right, folks. Well, thank you for 3 hours of your day today. The recorded lectures will probably be a little bit less lengthy, just because I tend to go on less soapbox without an audience. But we'll still get some good content through those recorded lectures. I hope you guys have a great weekend. I'll get you the stuff that I promised, and I'll look forward to seeing you all on Tuesday. Sound good?
Yeah.
All right, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm curious if, do we